Good evening. Welcome to tonight's On the Edge with me, Theo Chalmers. Tonight's show is 1 hour long and live, so if you have any questions for my guests during the show, text them to 87778 with the word EDGE, a space, and then your name, location, and your message, and we'll try to pick up on any that really hit the mark. They're all charged at your standard rate, so why not get ready to text? Tonight's show features a man who achieved fame and fortune by sitting in the streets of New York with a handwritten sign that simply said, "Free advice." In no time at all, he captured the heart and imagination of New Yorkers, gaining TV, newspaper, and magazine coverage. He quickly became a New York icon, as well as one frequently copied and emulated. He has gone on to give his free advice visits in cities all over the world, in his time counseling the great and the good, including at least 3 US presidents, Clinton, Obama, and Carter, and authors, philosophers, actors, and sportsmen, as well as the man in the street. He has written books which expand on his own philosophy of life, and, believe it or not, he is now exploring the philosophy of extraterrestrials. He is the original New York City free advice man. He is Jean-Pierre Adi Fenyo. What a show we've got tonight. Jean-Pierre, welcome.
Hi, good evening. How are you, Theo?
I'm very well, thank you. So, how did you get started? This is your sign, by the way, isn't it? Well, this is a modern version of it. Free advice, not qualified to provide medical or legal advice.
Yeah, well, actually, this is an original, one of the first signs that I ever held, back when I started in 1987.
87, so
yeah.
That's quite a long time ago, isn't it?
Yeah, and currently I hold that simple one because I've changed my sign quite a bit throughout the years. One thing I do always point out to people is that I'm not qualified to give medical or legal advice because I'm not a medical doctor and I'm also not, obviously, a solicitor. So.
Okay. So give us a little bit of background about how you came to be the free advice man.
Well, it's quite simple. I had been going through my own personal problems at the time. I had been through a marriage and it wasn't successful for many reasons, mostly not pertaining to my own weaknesses. And because I was down and out in New York at the time, and I didn't have my own place to live, and I had to spend nights at other people's houses and stuff like that. And I was pretty much down and out, except for I wasn't a vagrant homeless person. I was just having difficulty. And one night, late at night, I was sitting talking to this kid, this guy actually, older than myself, who was doing some naughty things at night, harming himself. And he noticed that I give great advice, and he said, you should be, like a counselor or something like that. And I said, I did study psychology. And so it occurred to me that very morning, early morning, that instead of going to sleep like I normally did, I would stay up, and I would just get myself a sign and put free advice, donations accepted. And I sat out right in front of this laundromat that had this metal box concealing a pump on the corner of Bleecker and 7th Avenue South, the Niagara Falls laundromat. Historic landmark at the time. A lot of people in the village, artists, intellectuals, would actually wash their clothes there. And so it was a great place also to meet important people. And I was sitting on this box with this very poorly designed sign. I must admit, it was in pencil, hardly legible. But even so, people could see what it said. And most people would just laugh and just drop a $5 bill into my lap, thinking, I was some poor misbegotten fool and that I didn't have any wisdom. So, but actually I did get some people asking for advice, and I realized I have to make my sign much more impressive, which I did right away that same day. And about a couple of weeks later, just before I got on TV, this police officer came by and said, you can't do that. I said, why? It's free speech. This is a free country. He said, that's not the problem. You can't be asking for donations. And I said, well, it's a gratuity, and nobody's forced to give it. It really is free advice. He said, no, you can't mention that. So I went to speak to the community affairs officer. The community affairs officer said, well, as long as you don't put donations accepted, you can continue doing it and nobody will bother you. Okay. And in fact, I became friends with the police at that point, to some extent, of course.
So what sort of advice were you giving out in your first early days?
Everything. I was talking to, from bums to billionaires. I was giving advice on relationship issues, which I still do. I prefer giving advice on issues about love, romance. I'm even interested in giving explicit advice on sex to adults only. I do not give advice. I do not give advice to minors unless they're in the company of their parents. And of course, I'm very cautious about what I say in the presence of children. I don't prefer to talk to juveniles, to be honest to you, because I'm more interested in expounding upon my philosophical ideas.
Okay. So this kind of developed from there, though, didn't it? Because, you know, somebody wrote an article about you in the New Yorker.
Yeah, Alec Wilkinson, who actually lived not far away from that part of Greenwich Village, suggested that he'd like to write a piece about me in the New Yorker. But that's after I got on, that's way after I was on TV and on cable and on radio, talk shows and stuff like that. I mean, that's at the end of that summer.
Oh, okay.
I started in April of '87. And 2 weeks after I started doing this free advice thing, actually a little bit later than that, I was on NBC Live at 5 with Sue Simmons. And it was Lloyd Kramer who interviewed me. And Lloyd Kramer is now famous for the movie 5 People You Meet When You Go to Heaven. And I will never forget that interview with Lloyd Kramer. It was the first time I'd ever been interviewed on TV. And he was very impressed. He was very impressed.
Yeah, fantastic. So did you actually make money out of this?
Not really. Obviously, there were people who were very wealthy who wanted to show some appreciation and understood that no strings attached gratuity or invited me to dinner. But I, for the most part, no, I actually had to spend quite a bit of money of my own money throughout the years to sustain myself doing this from work that I did otherwise. But I will tell you this, some people loved my advice so much and really did have some money, and they wrote out checks that, you know, compared to the amount of time I spent giving advice, if I figured it in that way, it would have been very expensive advice. But no, I don't sell my advice, and I refuse to take monies for my advice. It's free. Okay,
but you do accept, you know, donation.
At this point, I don't even accept gratuities in that way, for many reasons. Not because I ever made any real money on that. That's a false impression. Most of the money I made was from my own hard work, and it wasn't much, actually. There was a point when an executive of a toy company, this is literally out of the movie Big with Tom Hanks, literally out of the movie, asked me to join his board of trustees for his company and to advise them on toys. And after a few weeks, I decided that I didn't want to work with that company because he didn't like my opinion, and he kind of shooed me out of the office with some ugly words, thinking that I would, you know, he had enticed me. He'd given me a lot of gratuities and money and so forth, and I just decided, no, I can't do it. Violent toys are against my principles. I don't believe that violence is something we need more of in the world. We need less of it.
So what about your life experiences? I mean, what qualifies you as a giver of advice?
I often say, you know, when I was 6 years old, my mother took me to the circus, and I noticed at that sometime when I was 6 that there was this tiny little speck of light streaming right through the top of the tent. And it was just after the lights were shut off before the big show started. Okay. And I asked my mom, what is beyond the stars? You know, what's out there? And she said, more stars. And I said, well, what's beyond more stars? And she said, well, why? Why? It's just more stars. And at the age of 6, I conceived the concept of infinity. And so basically, when I had my life in throughout the world where I traveled with my parents, and I traveled to quite a few countries, I experienced things that most people don't experience, including war. And when I finally got back to the States, I had so many extreme contrasts in my life, so many experiences that really, really showed me how horrible life can be and how wonderful life can be, both.
You spent some time in Beirut, I believe.
That's true, but I'd rather not get into the details of that. I've mentioned it before that I was kidnapped once as a child there, very briefly. It was only less than a day, and I'd really rather not talk about that. But it was a bad experience.